Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, colleagues. It is my honor to welcome you at the opening of the working program of the 28th Forum 2000 conference. We live in a time of rapid and dramatic change. Current developments are shattering some of the very principles of the rules-based order. We see escalating conflicts in Ukraine, Middle East, Sudan, and we face mounting social, economic, and environmental challenges. Authoritarians advance, and democracies seem to be on the defensive. At this moment of uncertainty and global polarization, the international democratic community needs to find new ways to address these multiple problems. It needs to act collaboratively, emphasizing multilateralism and mutual respect, and stressing a balanced approach in the partnerships it forms. Trust and strategic engagement with partners in Africa, Latin America, Indo-Pacific, and elsewhere needs to be established. We have to overcome the apparent difficulties of this task and bridge the divides that hamper genuine collaboration. We need to work together as democracies and as democrats. That is why we, at Forum 2000 Foundation, increasingly work with partners in the Global South, and that is why we constantly seek to make the dialogue we engage in at the Forum 2000 conferences as global and inclusive as possible. Because if we are to defend the global liberal order, no single democratic country or narrowly defined group of countries can do it alone. A wide global democracy coalition needs to be established, one that includes democratic governments, but also civil society and individual citizens from all corners of the world. To analyze and define the building blocks of such a coalition, we have prepared the upcoming conference and divided it into 5 broad thematic areas: world order on the brink, fragile democracies, democracy and technology, forum for Ukraine, and thematic and regional focus. In the increasingly fragmented global order, authoritarian regimes are actively undermining the existing rules, establishing new authoritarian alliances, and promoting their own vision of the world, where the powerful dictate and the weaker and smaller obey. In the discussions focused on the current geopolitical reshuffle, we will be addressing the challenges presented by China, Russia, but also their allies and proxies, Iran, North Korea, or Maduro's Venezuela. In the thematic area focusing on the fragility of democracy, we will discuss how our own democratic systems are being weakened by our internal polarization and conflicts, but also how they are penetrated and hijacked from the outside. Our internal democratic debate, a precious and fragile territory on which we should jointly search for solutions and improvements of the democratic governance of our countries, is being twisted and radicalized. We need to work harder on making our institutions and governance mechanisms stronger. Artificial intelligence and other technological advancements are having an enormous impact on the public sphere and represent both a challenge but also a major opportunity for making democracy more accessible, inclusive, and agile. Exploring these trends will be a significant part of this year's conference, and we will look for ways to make AI and other technologies an asset for democracy. In this complicated environment, democrats around the world need to retake the initiative. And we need to prove that democracy still has the resolve and resilience, and that it remains the open and vibrant system that we cherish, and that hundreds of millions of citizens who live under dictatorships around the world aspire to. It is therefore important that we address the issues on the conference agenda seriously, and that this meeting results in some practical answers and solutions. At this moment, I would like to thank all our partners without whom this gathering would not be possible. In particular, the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Visegrad Fund, the Bosch Foundation, and the numerous partners and program partners that have made this conference thematically rich and hopefully interesting. On behalf of all of those who have worked hard to make our gathering possible, allow me again to welcome you at the 2024 Forum 2000 conference. We look forward to inspiring and productive discussions. And now, to deliver the opening address, it is my enormous honor to welcome a person who, throughout his illustrious career, has made defending democracy and proving its resolve his mission, both in his previous job as a soldier and in his today's role as politician and statesman, who works every day to promote civility, frank democratic dialogue, but also determination in times of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to invite to the podium the President of the Czech Republic, Mr. Petr Pavel.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is my distinct pleasure to be here again with you at the 28th Forum 2000 conference. For almost 3 decades, the aim of this forum has been to host some of the brightest minds to address the pivotal challenges of global civilization. For almost 3 decades, Forum 2000 has been serving as a platform for human rights defenders from all over the world. They, you, repeatedly come to Prague to stand up for people deprived of their rights in their homeland. Opposition activists, legal practitioners, independent journalists, and prisoners of conscience have been using this forum to showcase and shed light on lacking democratic standards and abuse of power. From Caracas to Kabul, from Harare to Khartoum, from Tehran to Naypyidaw, from Minsk to Moscow. Unfortunately, the list is much longer and has only been growing. It is no surprise that countries like North Korea, Iran, Niger, or Venezuela count among Russia's closest allies. The Russian aggression in Ukraine has led to a further increase in human rights violations, as it is an inspiration to those with disrespect to the others. Even as we speak, Ukraine is suffering from a targeted shelling of civilian infrastructure, specifically the energy and heating systems, used by the aggressor as a punishment for not bending to its will. We all have a responsibility to put an end to this decline in international standards. I consistently urge major global powers, and especially China, to use their influence to promote peace and international cooperation. This means not backing Russia's violent campaign, but also showing restraint in Taiwan Strait and addressing human rights violations at home. Today, authoritarian regimes converge in their interests, which is to undermine the rules-based order at the international level and to suppress opposition and civil society at home. Still, in the 21st century, we have been witnessing countries poisoning and murdering their own citizens. Anna Politkovskaya, Boris Nemtsov, or Alexei Navalny are just a few people who paid the highest price for their dream of democracy and human rights. We must not forget them. Furthermore, we must not forget the numerous political prisoners all around the world who live in terrible conditions and who are subjected to cruel and inhuman treatment and torture. Unlike the regimes that imprisoned them, these people did not use violence or blackmail. Their only weapon was their free speech and their firm belief that democratic governance is the best of the available alternatives. Russia has even taken the art of the expelling its own people to the next level. It trades its own human rights activists for its spies and murderers. This clearly shows the difference between the European and Russian perception of values. But even the darkest prison cannot extinguish a human desire for freedom, despite the efforts to break and silence its loudest advocates. I am pleased that one of these courageous people, Vladimir Kara-Murza, is here with us today. You are most welcome in Prague. Distinguished guests, democracy is closely linked to peace, stability, and prosperity. Our own story is a proof of that. History has also taught us that falling for false prophets who promise easy solutions can be extremely dangerous. Today, with the proliferation of hybrid threats, our own democracies are becoming more fragile and vulnerable. We must not close our eyes to this fact, but face it head-on. The frustration of people dealing with uncertainties related to high living costs, energy prices, or negative effects of migration is an ideal bedrock for polarization of our societies. Genuine facts, standards of critical debate, and science-based evidence are blurred by so-called alternative facts. The spread of disinformation incites hatred and undermines cohesion of our communities. Unfortunately, this only serves our adversaries, whose ultimate goal is to dismantle trust of our citizens in democratic institutions and thus critically weaken democratic states. Even the most traditional and strongest democracies are not spared from this threat. Therefore, we must take it very seriously and respond now. We need to mobilize and pool all necessary resources to defend and protect democracies, not only abroad, but also at home. In the digital age, we cannot bypass our reliance on technology or halt its development. Instead, we need to ensure that our communities have the right education and skills to use new technologies to their benefit, but also to become resilient to their abuse. This year, I had multiple opportunities to speak to leaders of the big tech companies, and I was really pleased to hear that they are well aware of their responsibilities. I am strongly convinced that close cooperation between tech companies, academia, and administration is key for enhancing our resilience in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, protecting democracies is not an easy task. It requires strong institutions, strong non-governmental sector, and broad international cooperation based on trust and common purpose. I am convinced that as democracies, we are not yet fully using our potential to shape the future. Our adversaries have managed to align their interests more effectively. Democracies should be able to do the same when it comes to defending their principles, both in the physical world and in the digital space. By pulling together, we can and will achieve much more. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, President Pavel. I'm Fang, President of Radio Free Asia, and I'm moderating the next conversation about global democratic partnerships. So if we can all join. So that was as we all get settled, that was a really fascinating remarks, President Pavel. And we heard also last night, our speakers spoke powerfully about the situation we find ourselves in today, what Walter called an axis of revisionist powers coalescing, and the dire potential consequences of inaction on the part of a responsible rules-based community. It's clear that authoritarian regimes today are cooperating on multiple levels. And I'm wondering, what is keeping democratic powers from doing the same? What is the biggest challenge to us right now? Can I start by asking President Pavel?
Well, my personal view, again from different engagements with leaders around the world and multiple fora, is that we still do not realize that the world has changed from the East-West ideologically based confrontation to a new phase where, on the one hand, we had first a group of democratic countries, but now I would say even bigger group of countries that would like to live in a world where rules are agreed and respected. And on the other hand, countries that still believe that the might comes, the right might, the might comes from right. Right comes from might, and that use the power to push their interest. And these countries are represented by different kind of autocracies, being it China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea as the most cited, but also some others that are inspired. And I believe that we have to bring our debate down to the basic level, that it's not about identifying who belongs to the camp of democracies and who not, because there are many countries around the world who might have a different kind of democratic deficit, but still are on the side of those respecting the rules. And it was clearly demonstrated recently in Switzerland at the Peace Summit co-organized by Switzerland and Ukraine, which in my view was more or less a global referendum on who's going to respect the rules and who is going only to respect the power. And the number of countries that were in favor of respecting rules in promoting UN Charter was much greater than a camp of democratic countries. That's why I believe we should extend our cooperation at the broadest possible level to protect the rules, because they defend all of us.
Thank you. And Walter, you have written extensively about this, and I'm wondering, what do you see as the challenge, and what is the future of U.S. leadership in defending the global world order?
Well, I'll talk about the U.S. here rather than other countries, but I think in the United States, too many of us still believe that the end of the Cold War was sort of the end of history, and that we don't have to worry anymore about the kinds of global conflicts or the kinds of challenges to democratic order that we saw in the 20th century. So that there's and on top of that, many people are consumed by problems at home. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who was Truman's Secretary of State, once said that the average American has less than 10 minutes a week to dedicate to the study of foreign affairs. And to some degree, that remains the case today. Ukraine can seem very far away if you live in Kansas. Taiwan can seem impossibly distant if you live in New Jersey. And so Americans need to develop a sense of solidarity and commitment, and a realization that what happens, whether it's in Africa or Latin America, the Indo-Pacific or Ukraine, actually matters to your family, your children. And this is what I think some of us in journalism and civil society need to try to do a better job of.
Great. Florindo, let me turn to you. We were talking earlier about Russia and China and what they're doing on the African continent. Can you educate us all about how they're functioning and what the U.S. and other defenders of democracies can actually learn from them, or what we can do to counteract what they're doing?
Well, thank you. I think China and Russia have done a much better job in terms of engagement strengthen relationship with African leaders. I think that's clear, and I think I should avoid that going to, using different. I think this is something we can learn from China and Russia. Now, I also think that the Russian invasion to Ukraine have shown how there is a fault line, and the Russian have intensely engaged throughout the continent in collaboration with the Chinese. Sometimes it's not very clear, but there's a strategy, in my view, to edge out the West and have a collaboration between the Chinese and the Russian to not just have access to mineral resources like cobalt we need for cell phones, lithium that we need for batteries, and through group, although the Chinese, there's no clear relation with the Wagner group, but where there's a Wagner group of working, is really clear the path for the Chinese to continue have access to natural resources. Now, the Russians, what I've seen is that they usual more tend to use more instability within the continent, which doesn't help the Chinese to advance its objectives in the continent. That might be a fault line between the two in the future for them to separate or not collaborate when it comes to access to natural resources. Now, the Chinese, they are also, not just strengthen the relationship through economic development, but they have managed to, better than the US and the EU, a type of free enterprise, which is, it's not beneficial for the continent, but they managed to persuade the local leaders to have access to funds without too many questions to ask. They don't care human rights, they don't care about transparency, unlike the IMF and the World Bank. And on the other side, in exchange with natural resources. And the other side, the Russians have been engaged in trade weapons, security service, and also in offering service for security through the Wagner Group. And I think what they have done, it's something that probably many of us didn't see coming. But with the invasion of Ukraine, it's have shown more the Russians inclined towards African to diversify its economy and fuel its war machine against the not just the Ukraine, but strengthen also its position throughout the continent. And I think what, and they didn't ask me this question, but what the West should do is probably listen also to the African voices. And I think it's important to continue to invest in democratic stability, which is it's an issue, and free enterprise as well. We need to stop this notion that somehow Africa only needs foreign aid for food and medication, that there are those poor 15 nations with no agency. And the Russians and the Chinese have proven otherwise. That's why they are far ahead, and we're way the US and the EU are way behind it. But the US and the EU should do this without compromising its values. I think that's important. The US and the EU doesn't have to compromise democratic values in order to catch up with the Chinese and the Russian. On the contrary, those are important to distinguish between those two and also important for the EU or US understand that any enterprise trade agreement or in the future has to benefit the population. There's a resentment. Africans are resenting because decades after trade multilateral agreements, people on the ground feel like they haven't benefited from. So in addition to the colonial resentment, so they feel like all those years of relationship with the EU and the US are not delivering a better quality of life of individuals on the ground. Instead, only few individuals, mainly connected to political power, benefit from, and that needs to be changed for the US to strengthen its relationship with the continent. Yeah.
Thank you, Florindo. Cecilia, I'm sure you can relate to much of what Florindo has said. China has infused Bolivia with a lot of cash during its economic crisis. And in many ways, these autocratic countries have been functioning in the same way in your region. So I'm wondering what you think that the US and the EU can do better to enhance its global partnerships.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And yes, I feel that Florindo is talking a lot about our realities, but at the same time, I want to emphasize that China's influence in countries like mine, Bolivia, which has a lot of lithium, for instance, has not been in favor of the population. And that's important to understand. That's not only a problem with the EU or the United States. In the end, it's a problem with all, the powerful countries that are not finding the way to really help develop local populations, especially vulnerable populations, indigenous populations. So that has been a structural and historical problem. The thing is that China doesn't put many conditions, no conditionality, and they emphasize that as a good thing. But in the end, it ends up being a way of allowing authoritarians to get the money and just move on with their governments, which is a disaster. So I think it is very important to emphasize that EU or the United States, and in general the international community, maybe also Japan, shouldn't be, lowering their conditionalities on human rights and on environment. I don't think that's a solution. I think that what we should be looking for is more effective public policies. But of course, that is easier with the governments like Costa Rica or Uruguay or, consolidated democracies. In our case, it's harder because China or even Russia, we have given Russia the right to operate the uranium chain from start to the end, which is even unconstitutional, and that's a threat. So, we have this very obscure and damaging relationships between autocrats and these countries. And we are also part of, an alliance in the region, Nicaragua, Venezuela, who are not democracies. I mean, not proper democracies or dictatorships. So that's a real challenge for countries like Bolivia and the international community, because there are limits on what the international community can do. Sovereignty would be a limit. And this is why, and I'm finishing with this, I think it is so important to foster and improve the multi-level cooperation. And that includes civil society, which is normally fighting for democracies, or even indigenous people who are fighting for their territories not to be destroyed by, mining or hydrocarbons, exploration, exploitation, and even cattle exports to China. Connecting with those valid concerns and struggles and fights that are being given at the local level and at the national level. And this is why Forum 2000 is so important, because it helps us to, to strengthen the international network to do this at a multi-level, in a multi-level sense. I'm talking about local communities, civil society, but also governments, and maybe multilateral organizations. Maybe one last reflection on this. The multilateralism and multilateral economic organizations like the World Bank and FME can help a lot, and helping countries like Bolivia develop in a sustainable and equitable manner. And now that we have these additional challenges like climate change, a tenth of my country has burned this year 10 million hectares fire because of climate change. So if we have these institutions that are better equipped to help us, I think we might have a chance if we connect these fights with the local, national, and international ones.
Thank you so much. So what I hear from what you're saying is that what autocratic countries are doing in your regions doesn't benefit the populations, and at the same time, you're saying, Florindo, that the U.S. and the EU, the sort of Euro-Atlantic democratic community, should do better in listening to populations. And so I'm wondering, Mr. President, how you hear that, and what we could be doing better in listening to the populations and enhancing civil society.
Well, first, within my almost 2 years as a president, I had an opportunity to meet a number of African leaders, but also to take part in 2 general assemblies of the United Nations. And I'm fully aware of the shifting the center of gravity in the world more towards the global south, to Africa as a very prospective continent. And I believe that we have to learn the lesson that the Chinese have learned some time ago, and that is to secure future resources, to secure future cooperation, but also to secure support of countries in Africa, in Latin America. We have to be much more open and less mentoring in our approach. And that's why I believe we need to seek for a true partnership that would benefit both sides, realizing that the profit is not the only criterion that we should follow. There is something bigger at stake. And we should talk to all the countries willing to respect the rules, what kind of world they want to live in. I listened carefully to the concerns of a number of countries at the UN General Assembly of not being part of the game. And they are absolutely right that they have to be more represented at the institutions. They have to be more represented in global issues. And it is our goal to approach the negotiations with these countries from that point of view, and also overcoming competition where it is not necessary. We are quite often competing between EU and US and between EU and other parts of the world, instead of realizing that we have the common interest, and that is not to let the system change in favor of those who prefer autocracy, because it is exactly against our own interest, and that's why I believe we have to take a new, fresh approach to our international cooperation, to the partnerships, being probably not too much focused on meeting all democratic standards and criteria before we start cooperating closely, because that's a precondition that cannot be met, and being more flexible, being more open, but also being frank in our common goals would push our cooperation further on.
Thank you. Walter, so when you were talking about revisionist powers, you had said something similar in 2014 when Russia seized Crimea, and China at the same time was increasing its aggression in the South China Sea. Is there any, at that time you called it the revenge of the revisionist powers, and I'm wondering, is there any lesson that we can take from, that was 10 years ago? Is there anything that the community of democracies should have been doing in that time that might change the outlook now?
Well, yes. I think it's impossible to avoid the conclusion that the last 10 years of policy since the first Russian invasion of Ukraine have been a failure. In that today Russia has occupied more of Ukraine, but Russian aggression is certainly not confined to Ukraine. Since 2014, the Russians helped Assad consolidate power in Syria at almost genocidal levels of violence. The Wagner Group, which is essentially a mercenary operation that has no respect for either law, human rights, or the dignity of any community with which it interacts, has become a major force in Africa in the face of what I think we have to call strategic passivity on the part of both the EU and the United States. I think it's very important that we're having this conversation in Prague, which is a city that has paid an enormous price for the failure to confront aggressive revisionist powers in the early stage. And more, what we are looking at is something like the interwar era between World War I and World War II, where weak policies, divided councils, distracted public opinion imposed a kind of strategic passivity on the genuinely peace-seeking powers, and that vacuum was filled by aggressive powers with absolutely disastrous consequences for the peoples of not only Europe but the world. One of the things that I think one learns from the study of history is that people often don't learn from history, and that we learn better from experience than history. That's tragic, can be tragic. We need to go back and look at what the failure to act, not rashly, not aggressively, not irresponsibly, but with sobriety, deliberation, due care for the rights and interests of the people with whom we are engaging, to oppose what is a genuinely monstrous effort to extinguish human freedom.
Florindo, in what Walter was just talking about with the Wagner Group, with the role of autocracies, where do you see Africa standing in this, what some would call a new Cold War between America and its allies on one hand and China and its allies on the other?
Russia and China they don't control the African leaders to a remote control. So the EU, the US have to engage with the African leaders, and again without compromising its democratic values, and I think it has to be a very genuine relationship. Well, Kennedy has done that in the past, and other U.S. leaders. Well, it's possible, even for you to trying to shift someone or a country that's so historically close to Russia or China and be a U.S. partner or EU partner. But it has to be a relationship. Well, and I understand that President Biden has done a tremendous work in terms to engage with the African continent, but how many times he has been in the continent? So you have to be there. You have to talk to folks. You need to build a relationship. a organic relationship based on mutual interest, and it's possible, to make sure that those relationships are sustainable, we have to make sure that people benefit from this relationship, and not just a few individuals that are benefit from, because that's how people are taking notes. People understand, and the only reason, or one of the main reasons why many are choosing a military regime, it's because the so-called democratic regimes that have been there for decades in places like Mali or elsewhere, they haven't delivered to the people.
We also talked earlier about the role of education in this, and I know that you have been very involved in education. I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to how that is important in educating the populations of all of our different countries.
Absolutely. I think so. I have to take a step for a second, and we'll look into the disinformation. Again, Russia is leading on disinformation in continent, places like Angola, and to educate people about how it's important for they to be involved, but also they are being listened to. They have agency. Their wishes and aspirations have been addressed. I think we probably first we need to counter-interact the disinformation that happening, because not too many people have enough time to read 8 newspapers and check the information. For the most part, whatever we see on our cell phones or computer, we believe in, because we don't have time. People don't have time to check fact every single day, reading 3 or 4 newspapers. Now, we need to enter on a much large level, using intelligence artificial, traditional media to counter this disinformation, because it's extremely damaging. For places like in US, maybe disinformation, fake news is a new concept. But for people like me, I was born and raised during communism in Angola. It was everyday disinformation. And it's not a new concept. And we need to invest more, and not just on the traditional media, but also social media to counter this disinformation. And we need to communicate more, not just with the people within the power, the civil society. There is no investment within the pro-democracy movement in places like Angola. And if we look into the budget, the U.S. budget on pro-democracy, even for the international and domestic organizations, it's hard even to understand where the money is going. But it's also hard to comprehend how much has been invested. It's important local actors are important, and we need to work with local actors in order to counter disinformation, in order to strengthen democracy on a local level. And I think if we do that, both working on higher level with the leadership and the civil society, I think we can reverse this new trend that we're experiencing in places like Angola about disinformation and dehumanizing the U.S. and how it has been damaged for the local politics and economy, when in reality that's not the case.
Cecilia, do you see the same role of disinformation in your region, and what can we do about it?
Oh, yes. First of all, I would like to emphasize that authoritarian regimes aren't delivering either. And they are many times much worse than democracies, at least in Latin America. And you can see it in my country or Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. There's an ideological problem also, or an ideological challenge, let's say. Some of our countries have governments that just prefer relationships with, authoritarian regimes or even dictatorships. And it's them usually that foster this kind of spaces where disinformation can prosper. It's like a way of seeing things, propaganda, which is such a, it's such an ancient tool from authoritarian regimes. They use it better and more than democratic regimes. And propaganda is just, I think, an example of what disinformation, which much more sophisticated tools because of artificial intelligence and digitalization is being able to convey to the population. So I think that disinformation has a lot to do with these ideologies that are not non-democratic. Governments that are non-democratic not only allow it to happen, but take advantage of it. So yes, it is a big problem. And because of these tools of AI, we are facing growing challenges in our own elections, for instance. So we really need international cooperation, to be connected to the national and local level, because we have to be able to defend ourselves, to identify first, which is not easy in populations that have to deal with basic things all the time. They just don't have the time, as Florindo was saying, to just try to understand what's behind this. They just receive information and are dealing with very acute economic and social problems or ecological problems, you see. So that kind of environment of urgencies, of big problems, fosters that disinformation in the end can win. So we have a big challenge there, which has to do with poverty and all those things. But I think that it is a fight we have to deal with. I mean, we have to engage with it, because it's critical for democracy. That we manage to understand. And I think there's a lot of civil society, again, NGOs, foundations, local populations, but also governments and international society that it's really interested in working these things. So we just have to do it, and do it in a very efficient and effective manner.
One of the challenges I think we've found in pushing back against disinformation is that for us, and I'm speaking as Radio Free Asia, but also I think in other countries in the democratic community, is that we are just trying to give the truth to people in countries where their news is censored. And I'm wondering, does it disadvantage democratic countries and their media and the way we try to push back on disinformation because we don't want to play dirty, because we don't want to just be messaging things that are propaganda?
Well, I would use an example from my work as the head of military part of NATO, and it was right after the annexation of Crimea. And there was a great wave of disinformation from Russia when it comes to annexation or a special operation and no military, Russian military in Crimean soil and so on. And there was a big debate within NATO if we should use the same tools as Russia. And my argument was then what would distinguish us from them if we start using the same arguments? I believe that our approach should be slightly different. We should strive taking wind out of their sails, because quite often we try to pretend being perfect. And I think it is some kind of discouragement also to our own people to believe in democracy, because quite often we portray the picture with almost no flaws. And we always try to demonstrate that there is a group of those with a different view, and that they are quite often seen as enemies, even internally. But I believe that we should lead a debate based on facts, debunking the myths, but also being very transparent and open when it comes to our own problems. Because if we openly talk about our problems, our deficiencies, then we will be credible to our own population, whose support we need, but also we will be more credible to our opponents. Because, again, one concrete example. If 10 years after operation in Libya, we still maintain the narrative that it was a strategic success, then what Russian propaganda needs to portray the opposite? They would use a couple of real pictures and say, so this is strategic success based on NATO. Do you want that? And the same goes to the problems that we face at home. If we try to hide them, if we try to marginalize them, then of course it's much easier for any propaganda, being it Russia, China, Chinese, or any other, to turn it against us, and it will get traction within our own societies. So I think coming back to the foundations and being open and transparent will in fact be part of demonstrating the power rather than weakness. It will make us more credible, more self-confident, and we can then face all disinformation much more effectively.
Thank you. Well. Walter, do you agree with that about being honest about problems in our own society, and how does this affect our ability to push back on disinformation?
Well, I think one of the things that I've noticed when I travel, especially outside of the West, is just how revolutionary the changes in the information environment for the average person have been in so much of the world. So if you know, in a country like India, something like 1 billion people have gotten access to smartphones in the last 10 or 15 years. And this means that people who previously might have lived in a rural village somewhere and had only quite limited exposure are now looking at their phone and they're seeing life is very different in other parts of the world, and they want to know why. And the reality has become much more complex for them. There are clearly different forces at work. We see consequences of this in the massive flows of migrants. Gee, I think I want to go. I think Geneva looks a lot better than my village. I think I'd like to go there. And it comes with an immediacy. And people want to understand, why is life this way where I am and some other way somewhere else? And so there are phenomena people want an understanding of. So when we think about information and how do we provide it, we need to think about the context in which people receive it and understanding better, so that we need, it's an intellectual task and not simply an informational task. And this means we're going to need to think more strategically about how do we approach the information environment. And by the way, it's also true that political leaders in these countries feel immense pressure because their populations are becoming much less patient as it becomes that much clearer that that in Angola the living standard is different from in Denmark or what it may be. Why aren't you delivering? Why aren't you able to achieve? So the standard of success is rising, and it's natural that when you confront such disparities, you start thinking why, and you start trying to develop theories. It's easy to conspiracy theories often come in as a very simple way to explain a complex phenomena. It's the bad guys, whoever they are. And this, for propaganda and disinformation, is a beautiful environment to work in, because people are curious, people don't know why things are happening. You come in with a strong, clear explanation, and it achieves a certain credibility. So I think on our side, so to speak, the side of democracy, we haven't thought hard enough yet about what is the kind of information that can really challenge propaganda and disinformation.
Yes, I would agree with that. Do you feel that that's the case? Is there anything that we could be doing better in trying to find ways to listen to the people and use that to cooperate with civil society?
Yes, well, I think it's important for us to invest more on freedom of press. Freedom of press is essential for democracy, and what we have seen in places like Angola is disinvestment on freedom of press. There are a number of radios, TV stations that have been closed, and there is no a single newspaper, private newspaper, that can provide, can deliver nationally. There are only few local newspapers. There are no a single radio or TV private that can broadcast throughout the country. Journalists have been detained. Some of them have been murdered. Every single day, we look into the news, we see what we have done to protect the freedom of press, to protect journalists, to make sure that we have a diverse channels of communication where people can speak freely about their everyday lives. So in places like Angola, that's not the case. Journalists are afraid, they auto-censored because they're afraid to speak. If they do, they end up in jail. So I think one of the ways we can counter disinformation is making sure that the journalists who are working every single day to make sure that people can share their views, opinions about what happened in the communities, they do have the opportunity that there are radio stations, there are AI is working, is available for anyone and pro-democracy in organizations or individuals to deliver the message. And so we don't have to engage on the disinformation on the same level as, or like the Chinese or the Russian in particular. We don't have to, and I agree. Then there's no way we can separate democracy or the state or democratic states from a authoritarian or kleptocracy. Now, but what we need to do is making sure we do defend, invest in one of those very important pillars of democracy, which is freedom of press. I think that's essential. And people are using social media to communicate. If we pay attention in places where there's no freedom of press, and if you really pay attention to, but you have to spend a lot of time, you will understand what people are saying because they find alternative avenues to speak about what's going on within their communities. And I think where there's openness, where people can freely speak about issues, where politicians can interact with citizens, I think disinformation doesn't have too much impact in comparison with the closed states where freedom of press is restricted, and the people sometimes they don't have channels of communication as we have seen in places like Angola.
I think that's a great way to end this panel, and I just wanted to end with a couple of takeaways. In order to find new ways for the Euro-Atlantic democratic community to cooperate with partners from the Global South, it's crucial to listen to the voices of the population. It's also important to invest in education and civil society. Remember that we don't have to sacrifice our values. And then finally, which I love, to strengthen local actors in pushing back against disinformation and supporting freedom of the press. Thank you so much to all of you.